A young daycare worker is admitting that she abused a child she was supposed to be taking care of, but the punishment she's expected to receive may not be what you're thinking. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. So last year, we brought you the story of two daycare workers who were arrested for child abuse. Kaye Johnson, now 24 years old, and Elizabeth Wiemerslage, 23, of Small World Daycare Center out in Blaine, Minnesota. Now, back in July, police received a report from a 5-month-old's parents who found bruising all over their child: thighs, groin, buttocks, legs. And when police contacted Small World, they, quote, were told it might be from the chair or swing in the immobile infant room. In fact, when police questioned Johnson, she reportedly said that she saw some redness on the infant's pelvic area in the afternoon on the 15th, and then saw that it had turned to bruising on the 16th, but she allegedly said that the bruising could have come from the infant chairs. And then when police questioned Wiemerslage, she said she didn't see any redness or bruising, but if there was, it was caused by the swinger chair. The problem with all that? The surveillance footage. Yeah, authorities say they got the surveillance footage that allegedly captures these women grabbing, flipping, dragging, and essentially manhandling infants in their care. And we're going to get to what the footage purportedly shows in a minute, but the reason we are revisiting this case now is because Wiemerslage has just pleaded guilty. According to court records, Wiemerslage pleaded guilty to malicious punishment of a child under 4 years and third-degree assault. CBS is reporting that if this plea deal gets the green light from the judge, 2 other charges are going to be dropped, and she'll get, listen to this, a 90-day jail sentence. That's it. Well, that's in terms of incarceration. She's also going to be ordered to undergo a psychological evaluation and write an apology letter. We're going to talk about that. So according to the information that we found on TruthFinder, this powerful background search engine, Wiemerslage had no criminal history before this. All we had to do was type in her name and location, and within seconds, we had access to information like her address or phone number, but TruthFinder didn't pull up any information on any prior criminal behavior. Now, Law&Crime, we partner with TruthFinder. We use it to get details on people involved in our stories, but even if you don't work in true crime, it can be an excellent resource to give you some peace of mind. After all, it's one of the largest public record search services in the United States. And with a paid subscription service, you can get access to unlimited reports about almost anyone. So right now, if you're interested, you can get 50% off of your first month of confidential background reports. Just go to truthfinder.com/LC-sidebar. But yes, all of this comes down to the surveillance footage, okay? And I warn you, this is tough to hear, but according to a police affidavit, it reads, around 9:07 a.m., defendant Johnson is sitting with infant 1 on a floor mat and starts moving infant 1 around aggressively. Over the next several minutes, defendant Johnson grabs infant 1 by her upper thighs, hip, and groin area and violently flips infant 1 back and forth from her stomach to her back, not allowing infant 1 to remain on one side for longer than a few seconds. Infant 1's arms are flailing outward and her body is consistently rigid as her face contacts the floor mat repeatedly as she's being flipped and her head is unsupported. There's no audio, but infant 1 appears to be screaming with her mouth open as this is happening. Just horrific. There's really no other way to say it. And the affidavit explains that Wiemerslage is there as this is going on and is seemingly just watching this. But we want to continue. In the video, quote, defendant Johnson is also seen picking up another infant, infant 2, roughly, and holding a cloth over the infant's mouth and nose for several seconds while infant 2 is crying. Defendant Johnson is gripping infant 2 firmly by the neck before she violently pulls them up by the arm and shoves a bottle repeatedly in and out of infant 2's mouth too rapidly for infant 2 to be drinking from it. Later in the video, defendant Johnson is seated next to defendant Wiemerslage, who picks up infant 2 and violently slams the infant down onto a support pillow. At another time, defendant Wiemerslage is seen picking up another infant, infant 3, and aggressively shoving them down onto a changing table. Defendant Wiemerslage aggressively drags infant 1 towards her by her legs before she picks her up aggressively and slams infant 1 into a support pillow and presses down hard on infant 1's torso and abdomen. So infant 1's parents are the ones who made that initial report, but according to court documents, infant 2 and infant 3, they underwent medical examinations for potential injuries. More bruising was found. One of the babies had a leg fracture believed to be about 2 weeks old. The probable cause document says medical reports indicate that infant 1 sustained bruising in 9 different areas on her body, including her groin, buttocks, thighs, shins, and abdomen. The reports indicate the bruises range from 1 centimeter to 5 centimeters in length and consistent with a grip injury or squeeze type injury, and are inconsistent with a chair or strap injury. The reports further diagnose the bruising as inflicted injuries due to the bruising pattern and immobility of infant 1. According to police, quote, defendant Johnson initially told officers she was helping the infants learn how to roll over, but ultimately admitted she was too rough and admitted her behavior could have caused infant 1's bruising. Defendant Wiemerslage also admitted to her behavior and that it was wrong. Now, Blaine police said in a statement, although we have been forced to investigate other terrible acts of child abuse, this one is exceptionally shocking. Most parents drop their children off at daycare centers believing that their child will be safe, especially since there's usually more than one care provider watching their child at one given time. In this case, we found 2 workers working together with infants, both aggressively abusing children. And the daycare provider, Small World Learning Center, released a statement at the time to KSTP in Minneapolis saying, quote, we as a company do not condone the acts of the 2 individuals involved in the incident. The 2 teachers in question were terminated immediately and indefinitely. We are remaining open to continue supporting our families who rely on us for care and stability during this difficult time. We want to remind everyone that in the 24 years the Small World Learning Center organization has been open, that this is the first time something of this nature has happened. We have a team of fully dedicated teachers who love what they do and are here for the safety and well-being of the children in their care. We are cooperating with the Blaine Police Department and DHS to locate any weaknesses in our policies and procedures to ensure this does not happen again. However, these may not have been the only children to experience abuse at this daycare center. Why? Because a man named Cody Pesh posted on Facebook, 2 daycare workers were caught on camera abusing infants at Small World Learning Center in Blaine, Minnesota, and our 5-month-old son was one of them. He received scratches and bruises all over his body and suffered a fractured leg from their abuse. The despicable humans that did this were arrested on Thursday but are already out on bail. Please share this post so the world knows what these evil human beings did. And then you have another woman, Rihanna Lee, said she pulled her child out of that same daycare center. She posted, I pulled Gray from this daycare after multiple mysterious incidents where he kept hurting himself, where I'd come pick him up with a bloody nose, marks in his body, rug burn, etc., just to find out a month later that 2 of the teachers that were in the room were caught abusing kids. People knew what was going on there and did nothing. Now, Representative Nolan West, who we've had on the show before, came forward saying his child was abused at Small World Learning Center. In fact, according to the Minnesota House website, Representative West introduced several bills related to child care just this month. And these include bills that would require child care centers to use video security cameras to monitor infants and toddlers, set up a program where maltreatment would have an investigation requirement with the results posted publicly for at least 10 years, and establish mandatory minimum sentences for a malicious punishment of a child. And when we spoke to Representative West last year, he said he was blindsided by the daycare workers' arrest.
Utter disbelief. Like, oh, well, one, they said teachers at Small World is how I heard about it. While I was reading this Facebook post, which is actually one of the big problems, is the vast majority, all but like 2 families, discovered that any of this was going on from a Facebook post, not from the daycare telling them. I mean, like, the daycare should tell you when police are investigating. I mean, but they found out where Sybil was, and then seeing the mugshots of her 2 teachers was just like, even while reading it, I didn't immediately assume. Well, especially because one of them seemed so nice and lovely, honestly. And yeah, we did. Then you saw it, and it was completely flabbergasting. I couldn't believe it.
Now, Wiemerslage will be sentenced on May 16th when the judge will decide whether to uphold the sentencing conditions of the plea deal she made. Johnson's case still ongoing. She has a hearing now for May 13th. But we had an opportunity to sit down with Ashley Knarr, managing partner at the Button law firm that actually focuses on daycare abuse. Take a listen. Ashley, thank you so much for coming on. It's good to see you. I guess the best place to start is, since we haven't really spoken about it, overall thoughts on this case. I mean, how often do we see something like this, and particularly in your profession?
Well, thank you for having me, Jesse. First and foremost, as soon as I heard about this case, shock. Absolute shock. What happened here is every working parent's worst nightmare, because parents have the right to expect that when they put their kids in daycare, they will be kept safe, nurtured, and most importantly, they will never be subjected to this type of abuse. And I mean, the court records in this case show that the prosecutor's office has evidence of months of abuse by these caregivers against what they identify as potentially 10 different children dating back as far as October of 2023, months before these even ever came to light. Now, assuming that those court records are accurately reflecting that timeline and the shocking amount of children that were impacted by this, what we have here is a classic case of a daycare hiring bad caregivers, failing to train them on how to handle children, and most obviously, a daycare continuously failing to supervise their employees. It's a systematic failure of this daycare and allowing this to happen to kids that they were hired to keep safe.
There wouldn't be a case here, though, if we didn't have surveillance footage. Would that be fair to say? I mean, first of all, you're dealing with victims who can't speak for themselves, right? And you're also, that footage is the strongest piece of evidence you would have at a case. I mean, if you didn't have the surveillance footage, would we be even talking about this?
Jesse, it is frightening to imagine what else could have happened here if there wasn't footage. Surveillance cameras are the best thing to happen to child safety in daycares. They protect the children, and in this case, they hold the daycare accountable when they endanger a child. And we always recommend to parents that they only use daycares with surveillance footage in all classrooms all the time. Daycares without footage make it much more difficult to prove exactly what happened to a child and why. And that's especially true when they try to avoid responsibility with a cover-up, like lying or blaming something else for what caused the injuries. And what's scary is, despite this daycare having surveillance cameras, we know from the case records that when the parents came to this daycare asking why their kid had bruising on their lower half of their body, the daycare tried blaming it on something else. And without footage, how could you go back and verify the truth? It's truly scary what could have been overlooked and missed and potentially still putting kids in danger to this day without it.
Is it because of that surveillance footage that we see this guilty plea?
Honestly, Jesse, in cases like this, taking a plea agreement and pleading guilty is very common. When a criminal defendant is facing really strong, irrefutable evidence, such as surveillance footage like this, but also the medical records that actually show the injuries that these kids suffered, and an outraged community. Pleading guilty can be a part of the defendant's strategy in attempt to minimize the consequences that they would have faced if this had gone to trial. So I imagine that in this case, she likely considered the potential outcome of a jury finding her guilty after watching that surveillance footage of what the court documents state is showing her personally harming these kids, but also sitting by and watching the kids be harmed by her co-teacher and not doing anything to step in and intervene and stop this abuse. And so her plea of guilty allows her to plead guilty to 2 of the charges while the other ones get dropped and avoid a full-blown criminal trial with all of that evidence coming out to light.
And I mean, she was looking, our estimate, right, was the maximum sentence for each count was 5 years in prison. So maybe you would even looking at double digits in prison if she was ultimately convicted. At least that's our assessment of what the sentencing range was. But you look at the sentence here, 90 days in jail. Does that seem sufficient? Let's start there, because obviously there's more components to it, like the apology letter and the psychological evaluation, but let's take it piece by piece. You think that incarceration period is sufficient?
Child abuse is a serious crime, plain and simple. There is absolutely no excuse for it in daycares or anywhere. And so according to the court records that we've looked at, yeah, she was facing up to 5 years in jail for the different felony counts. And then she had 1 gross misdemeanor account that's going to be dropped with this plea agreement that she's entering into. But it's important to remember that as of now, the plea agreement has not yet been accepted by the court. That's going to happen at the sentencing hearing. And that's when the full range of what it is she's facing is truly going to come to light. What we do know as far as what's on the table right now is that in exchange for pleading guilty for those 2 charges, dropping the other 4, she's going to receive 90 days in jail, and then also will likely receive some sort of probation sentence thereafter that is decided by the judge after the judge considers what's called a pre-sentencing investigation report. And so that report is going to help aid the court in outlining more details related to her sentencing, such as the length of probation that she might face after she completes the 90 days in jail, as well as any other additional requirements like mental health related services, completing community service hours, those types of parameters and details that we just don't know yet. At the end of the day, she gets to avoid facing potentially serving 5 years or more and going to trial to end up with a guilty conviction. Now, is it enough? I mean, is it truly enough? I don't believe it is. I don't believe it is at all.
Well, an apology, right? The apology letter. Is that unusual? And what does that look like?
Unusual? Not really. It is starting to pick up a lot of, it's starting to become more and more encouraged by different courts across the country. And that's because remorse and apology are such powerful forces in everyday life. I mean, Jesse, it goes back to what we learn as kids when our parents make us say sorry for our everyday wrongs. It's a practice that jurisdictions encourage, especially in cases like this. And so Minnesota, they allow and encourage letters of apology in the criminal context because they humanize the crime. They force the defendant to face the parents, admit that she mistreated these kids, acknowledge the injuries and the pain that she caused, and take responsibility for the harm, not just on the kids, but on their families and the community as a whole. I mean, as an attorney that handles daycare and child injury cases, all too often I hear from parents that what they really want is the person and the daycare to accept responsibility, to say that they are sorry, to ensure that it will never happen again. And so the defendant making this public apology to parents is just one piece of that, but it can be really powerful for families. And I think that the court recognizes that in this case.
Now, the other component of this is the psychological evaluation. What can we expect from that?
So when a defendant wants to plead guilty, in most jurisdictions, they require what is called a pre-sentencing investigation. And this investigation is typically spearheaded by the probation department in that state. And it involves a really thorough review of the case, including the charges alleged, the evidence that the prosecutor's office had against the defendant. It incorporates the impact on the victims, of course, but it also details things about the defendant personally, including their psychological and mental health. And so the psychological evaluation is part of that process. It helps paint a picture for the court about who this defendant is and potentially why she did what she did. Like, does she truly understand her actions and that the way that she treated these kids was wrong? Did she have any mental health conditions that impacted her decision-making process? And will she be a risk to children in the future, impacting her ability to work with kids? And so the court will use that report, including the psychological evaluation, to determine those details of her sentencing. And what it can lead to, ultimately, is certain things that she has to complete during her probation portion or during her incarceration, such as mandatory mental health counseling, classes maybe on prevention of child abuse and neglect is something that I see often. And potentially it could lead to her never being able to work with children again. It's ultimately up to the judge in this case as far as what the judge deems necessary and fair and just. And I mean, these specific requirements, including that psychological evaluation, it's going to be tailored to this defendant, to this case, and hopefully those requirements will help make sure that she can never do anything like this again to any other child.
You said this defendant, which brings me to this point. Johnson is still on the hook. Her case is still moving forward with a hearing in May. Why hasn't she pled guilty yet? And the fact that Wiemerslage has pled guilty, does that affect Johnson's case? So again, why do you believe Johnson hasn't pled guilty? And how do you believe Wiemerslage pleading guilty will affect Johnson's case?
Well, each criminal defendant is going to approach this with their own strategy, their own considerations in mind. While the evidence seems to overlap in the sense that this footage shows both of these caregivers mistreating these children, mishandling them, and causing lifelong consequences, the records that we see now, they're currently unclear about that. We can only guess as to why she hasn't pled guilty. But a lot of different things are at play. You have the prosecution's office making their deal, putting their deal on the table. You have the defense attorney accepting or coming back with their own idea and their own deal. Then you have the court at the end of the day that's going to have to approve anything that is presented to them. So in terms of why she hasn't pled guilty yet, one can only guess. In terms of the likelihood of her pleading guilty in the future, same thing as Wiemerslage. I mean, pleading guilty in these types of cases is very common, and it's a way to minimize the potential consequences that a criminal defendant will face if the case goes to trial and all of this evidence comes out to light before the public.
Moving away from the criminal case now to a potential civil case, do you anticipate litigation against Small World, and what could we expect there?
Now, Jesse, I don't know the mindset of the parents and the families involved at this time, but in a civil lawsuit, there is definitely a potential case against the daycare. Everything we know from the criminal case, like the surveillance footage showing what happened here, to the medical records showing the actual injuries, that is just the beginning. In my experience, the reason why families bring civil cases against daycares is because they are looking for the why. The answer to how is it that this could have happened for so long and no one stepped in to stop it. The camera footage shows that it did happen, but it doesn't paint the full picture. It doesn't paint the why. It doesn't give families the type of justice they truly need to ensure that this doesn't ever happen again. And so taking legal action against the daycare is a route for families to figure that out. How could it have happened for so long? And how can we protect other children from being harmed in the future?
Let's talk about that. Let me end on this point, how to protect children in the future. So I mentioned this before you came on, but according to the Minnesota House website, Representative Nolan West has introduced legislation, and it's really powerful. We're talking about requiring child care centers to use video security cameras to monitor the children, setting up a program where maltreatment would have an investigation requirement with the results posted publicly for at least 10 years, establish mandatory minimum sentences for malicious punishment of a child. What are your thoughts on that legislation? And I can't imagine what the pushback would be.
Do the laws need to change? 100% the answer is yes. Now, every state, including my home state of Texas, has child safety laws in place to keep kids safe. But one of the things that most states do not have are laws requiring surveillance cameras in daycares and other child care facilities. That definitely needs to change. And it is a part of that legislation that Representative West is pushing. And in familiarizing myself with this case, I came across it. And it's a relief to know that there are people on the ground advocating for these changes in child safety measures, such as cameras in daycares, such as posting requirements for a minimum of 10 years. Most states right now only have publicly available 2 years maximum. And what's available to the public is so vague. It doesn't include the full picture. It doesn't include what parents need in order to consider whether this daycare that they're choosing for their kid is a safe daycare. And so, I mean, at a bare minimum, Jesse, cameras have to be mandated in daycares. I mean, technology is so ingrained in our daily lives. It's so accessible. There's no reason not to. It's not expensive, it's easy to install, it's easy to manage, and it keeps kids safe. So why would we not do it? Why would we not have more legislation being put forth by active representatives in our state across the entire country?
It's a fair assessment. I'm going to be curious to see where this one goes in terms of the legislation. And I'm also curious to see what happens with Johnson's case. If, now we see a guilty plea there, or how this guilty plea actually affects that. So there's still a few moving parts. Ashley Knarr, thank you so much for taking the time, and appreciate the work that you do on behalf of the victims of child abuse at these daycare centers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jesse.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.